everyone to the 19th meeting of the Culture, Tourism, Europe and External Affairs Committee and our 10th remote meeting. We have apologies today from Kenneth Gibson MSP, Ross Greer MSP and Dean Lockhart MSP. However, I am pleased to welcome Rachel Hamilton MSP to the committee as a substitute member for Dean Lockhart today. Can I ask Rachel Hamilton whether she has any interest to declare that are relevant to the remit of the committee?
Yes, thank you, convener. I would like to draw members to my register of interest. I have an interest in a small hospitality business in the Scottish Borders.
Thank you very much, Rachel. And for clarity, I'd like to draw attention to my own declaration of interest in that I am the chair of a small heritage charity which has received funding from the Heritage Lottery Fund. Thank you. Our first agenda item is evidence on the impact of COVID-19 on Scotland's heritage sector. Can I welcome to the meeting Philip Long, the Chief Executive of the National Trust for Scotland, Alec Patterson, the Chief Executive of the Historic Environment Scotland, Caroline Clark, Director of the National Lottery Heritage Fund in Scotland, and we hope to be joined by Giles Ingram, the Chief Executive of the Abbotsford Trust. There have been some technical difficulties there, but we hope to join Giles at some point during the committee session. I would remind members to give broadcasting staff a few seconds to operate your microphones before beginning to ask your questions or to provide an answer, and I would be grateful if questions and answers could be kept as succinct as possible. As we have a larger than usual panel for the format of the meeting, I'd be grateful if members could indicate which of the panel their questions directed to. I will open up questions and then I shall move to the Deputy Convener, Claire Baker, before bringing in other members. So thank you very much, all of you, for joining us this morning. And thank you also for the very detailed written submissions that you made ahead of your appearance, which I think all members of the committee found very helpful. One of the things that this committee is particularly interested in this inquiry now is looking ahead at perhaps some of the permanent structural changes across the tourism and culture sectors as a result of the pandemic, and your written submissions addressed that very well. And in particular for heritage, you addressed potential focus on making better use of green spaces and the challenges of that, the fact that you're dependent on volunteers who tend to be older, the challenges of that, and also how to attract more younger visitors, given that older visitors may be staying at home. How do you make adjustments for older visitors? And I noticed that a number of you talked about identifying new sources of income and the challenges of domestic visitor income replacing international visitors who tend to spend more. So you clearly have identified the need to restructure, but I wonder, if you could perhaps share with the committee how long that restructuring process will take, and perhaps drill down on some of the kind of measures that you would need to take to adjust to the new reality. Who would like to go first? Caroline, perhaps?
Thank you, convener. As you'll have seen from our written report, we have done a survey of the sector and more recently a deep dive interview which has absolutely highlighted issues such as depletion of their reserves and the impact of COVID on the older volunteers, which are an absolute bedrock of the heritage and cultural sector in this country. We are going to have to look at how we can engage young people in the sector through placements, meaningful volunteering opportunities that result in qualifications that give them opportunities to carry on with additional employment in that sector as they move on in life. And I think we also need to look really hard at working collaboratively between the different national organisations that operate across all the rural and urban areas of our country, because for me a particular aspect that's coming out strongly is risk around rural areas that rely really heavily on tourism and how we support keeping young people in those areas to keep those heritage and cultural assets alive and thriving, because we do project that it will be not until, say, 2023 that things are back to pre-COVID levels of viability.
Thank you very much. That's very useful. I believe that we have Giles back. Giles, can you hear me? I think Giles Ingram, we still have technical issues there with Giles. Perhaps I could go to Alec and ask Alec, like these challenges that you yourself have identified in the paper, but in terms of the work that Caroline's organisation has done in identifying the challenges, is that something that you recognise, and how are you going to go about meeting those challenges going forward?
Thank you, Kavira. Good morning. I think through all the research from Caroline's organisation, from my own organisation, there's a number of consistent themes that come through. The obvious ones being, delays to projects, increased costs. How do you replace lost revenue, threats to jobs and expertise, and so on. And I think going forward, there are probably quite a number of things that are important to look at. I think the first thing I would say is that in looking forward, we shouldn't forget that most organisations in the sector are still grappling with the here and now challenges of the COVID emergency and its impact on their organisation. So in looking forward, absolutely, and I'll offer you some thoughts on that just in a second, but the realities of getting through the current crisis is still very much at the forefront of people's minds. On one or two of the things you mentioned, I think the whole thing about young people is really interesting. It's been interesting over the last couple of years where we've tried to work with Young Scot to provide reduced access to our properties. That has been well received. But I think beyond that, there's a number of things that we might do to engage more young people. So, for example, we've been doing a lot of work over recent years through education and learning, using the historic environment to teach STEM subjects. So that's now part of the national curriculum, and I think engaging through education is really, really important as well. But I think, and this ties in with the programme for government this week, the whole opportunity around skills and employment for young people in this sector is really, really important. A year or so back, we published a skills investment plan for the heritage sector, the first time that has been done, and that set out a number of challenges and objectives for the sector. And there will be a need for further skills and job opportunities in traditional skills. The historic environment portfolio in Scotland, whether it's houses or castles or anything else, it needs constant reinvestment and the skills with which to do that. But this sector is also at the leading edge of climate research. It's also at the leading edge of digital technologies and the green agenda. And so I think there's a real opportunity with young people around skills in education and training. Use the First Minister's phrase the other day, new jobs, good jobs and green jobs. And I think this sector has a real opportunity with young people to offer those opportunities.
Thank you very much. That's a very upbeat assessment, which is good to hear. I don't know if we've got Giles now. No, I don't think we've got him. Could I move on to Philip Long then? We wrote to the National Trust for Scotland about the redundancies when they were first threatened. So we're very pleased to see that a number of properties are going to open and many jobs are being saved as a result of the Scottish Government's investment. Can I ask you, Philip, in terms of that investment, how did you identify the properties which were going to be saved, and whether there remains a gap in funding and a risk to the Trust in the short to the medium term? And if you want to address some of those other concerns about long-term opportunities and sustainability, that would be welcome too.
Thank you very much. And can I start by saying that I'm very grateful indeed that the Scottish Government supported the turnaround plan that we developed in consultation with Scottish Enterprise, and for the initiative that a group was put in place to look at that. The Trust was facing a severe crisis, and but I think I can echo Alex's upbeat position and like to focus on some of that today. We early in the crisis, we identified that it may be possible to reopen around 27 properties, and we've been able to increase that significantly to around about 33 properties. And we've looked at that across the portfolio of properties to see how we can address property reopening through the effect it contributes to securing employment, to contribution to local community, and geographical spread as well. I think was very important for us in looking at that from an original at-risk position of roles of 429, with the support that we've received from government, with the support that we've received from people across the country and internationally into our fundraising campaign, and through the actions that we've taken, we've been able to reduce redundancies now to 226, of which about 188 are compulsory. So, of course, we regret the loss of any of our staff. But that is the reality of the position, and it is a more positive one than was the situation. I'd like to briefly touch upon some lessons learned and then opportunities, which I think picks up on what my colleagues in other organisations have said so far, but I hope doesn't repeat that, because I'd agree very much with what they have said. I mean, the first thing to say is that we're not out of this crisis. We need to continue to be agile in our response, and so our planning will need to remain relatively short term. There's a lot of uncertainty remaining. I think that it's very important the discussion with our colleagues across the sector and with government must be continuous, proactive, and lead to actions to ensure that we manage the situation. And a lesson learned very clearly, as we've begun to talk about, is there's been a very real human cost as a consequence of the pandemic that goes far beyond the direct one of ill health. It is affecting employment and many wider well-being concerns. And we have seen that particularly in relation to our responsibilities to our volunteers, who contribute an enormous amount to the National Trust for Scotland. And I think similarly, the National Trust for Scotland supports people who are able to take up voluntary positions and contribute contribute through that to a sense of purpose and well-being. Also, I'd echo the points made about the demographic of volunteers, and there are opportunities ahead to look at that. And this sector has been considering that, particularly through the Make Your Mark strategy, to encourage a much wider demographic of volunteers to be involved with the heritage sector. In terms of opportunities ahead, it's very clear to the sector through this, ever more so, that we are a very diverse one, and I think we've come more closely together. I think we understand our role and our contribution better. It's much more than one of a custodian and a carer. We contribute to the economy, to our communities, to people's well-being, to employment, to how our nation is understood in this country and around the world, and the finance that goes into our organisations flows back out in support of the wider economy. So I would echo the others in the submissions and in what we've begun to discuss, that it's important that we're going to work more closely together to define what we bring to the country and understand how we can work, I think, in even broader partnership. So we can, because I can see it's been accentuated to all of us, the social benefit that we bring through provision of learning, skills development, environmental improvement, and sustainability of communities. And so, while the great uncertainty and concern remains, our planning will begin to look in earnest at a long-term plan as we get into next year, at the lessons learned from this and the opportunities that it brings.
Okay, thank you very much. There's a lot in there to unpack, and I know that a lot of members of the committee are keen to unpack them with you. So I shall now move on to Claire Baker, the Deputy Convener.
Thank you, Convener. Could I ask Alex and Philip are probably best placed to respond to the question. It is about funding and about the rescue packages that have been announced by the Scottish Government and any other funders who have come forward. It's also been a difficult time with the closures, and there'll be losses that you've experienced perhaps through membership and through generated income. So the question is, the funding packages that have been awarded, are they enough? How long, what timescale will the funding packages see you through to? And is there a funding gap? And do you anticipate if there's a funding gap, it to be in this financial year or next financial year? And either Philip or Alex could go first.
Happy to go. Thank you for that. Well, our current financial situation, which I think is important to set out before I get to the specific question, is that, yes, our earned income is very substantially down, but as a consequence of the actions that we've taken, which have included the redesignation of funds, the sales of alienable property, the freeze across our activities, the success of our fundraising appeal and the support of government, whether it's through the direct grant from Scottish Government or the wider government schemes and the utilisation of our reserves, we can demonstrate that we are a going concern and that we can continue to operate. Regrettably, as I've said already, that has required the loss of staff, but we are in a situation now where we can look forward with a far greater degree of confidence, albeit the continuing uncertainty. And so that overall range of action and support enables us to demonstrate a going concern, and it also enables us to begin to invest in our activities that will help us make more of our properties accessible again, and that investment will flow out into the wider economy. It addresses the reality of the situation right now. More investment would help us to do further work, which would flow out further and to support the sustainability of the organisation in the future. What we have been discussing with government colleagues is that our conversations will continue, because we want to work with stakeholders, with all of our stakeholders, and particularly with government, to ensure that we're planning for a sustainable future for the trust. And dealing with that will be not just about cash. It will be ways of working in partnership and considering how we operate on our properties in the future to make to continue to work towards making the organisation as sustainable as possible.
Alex, would you like to respond to?
And maybe if I could just set out a little our funding position and where the recent announcements from Scottish Government fit in and help us with that. I think that the first thing to say is that I think many people will perceive my organisation as looking after visitor attractions, whether it's Edinburgh Castle or Rigel Brodgar or well-known attractions across Scotland. And of course we do, and we operate them as visitor attractions, and we're responsible for their care and looking after them so that not only we enjoy them, but those who come in future generations enjoy them. But we also have a role in heritage management through designations and listings and consents. We're a regulator, we're part of the planning system, we look after fantastic archives, Scotland's national record of the historic environment. We have distributed over £14 million in grants over recent years per annum, and we do a lot of work around education and research, all of which are outlined simply to make the point that we have two main sources of income coming into the organisation. One is funding from Scottish Government through grant and aid, and the other one is income that we generate ourselves, largely through visitors to our sites, buying tickets, spending money in our shops and the cafes, and so on. We don't have the ability to build and carry forward reserves, for example. And so if you look at that in the context of this year, then Scottish Government grant and aid to us to fulfil a whole range of functions equates to averaging over 2-3 years, 36–38% of our total budget. The obvious implication is that over 60% of our budget, of our annual budget, is self-generated. And clearly, last year, when we had 5.2 million visitors paying to access our sites, that was quite a substantial income that we had. When you take 5.2 million out of the equation, that leaves quite a significant hole in our funding. So comparing our opening budget for this year to where we are now, we estimate that 85% of our non-government funding has been adversely impacted by the coronavirus pandemic, largely related to the implications of visitors to sites and largely related to international visitors. So that's created a hole of about £53 million in our budget for the year, quite significant and quite challenging. We've done a number of things to try and address it. Our plans for the year, which we were developing in January and February, we parked and we developed a 6-month action plan and budget, which has we've delivered successfully. We've had to reduce our costs. We've been focusing on business critical activities. A lot of what we do, we had to pause. Sites were closed, so we didn't have to operate them. Our conservation teams couldn't get on sites to do what they would normally do. So a lot of activity was paused, but we focused on business critical, that which we could do. We had to cut back some of our investment plans. We accessed the job retention scheme from the UK government, which was helpful. Of course, we are part of government, and we therefore are covered by the no compulsory redundancies policy, so there was never any threat to our staff. But through a combination of focusing on critical activities, of capitalising or making use of the job retention scheme, we were able to save, I guess, about £16 million, and the funding announced from the Scottish Government in recent days has been very helpful in also enabling us to continue to fulfil our functions. And as Philip said, and I would echo this completely, it's not just money to HES, it's money to HES to allow us to do the work which we're asked to do, which in turn flows through into spend with small businesses, suppliers, contributing to jobs and so on in the economy. And just come back to the question about, is it enough? It is enough for this year, and the funding is for this year. And normally at this time of year, we are preparing for spending review discussions and so on for the year to follow, and that's where we're at. So we're comfortable and we're fine with the arrangements we have in place for 2021, but we are clearly already giving serious thought to how do budgets and sources of income look for 21-22 thereafter. Of course, an awful lot of that is predicated on how do we think the visitor economy might recover in the next 12 months.
Thank you. I understand that Caroline would like to come in, but if I just ask the second question, I'll then have Caroline come in first. Well, it's interesting Alex talked about the visitor numbers. I suppose I'm interested in the guidance that you're currently working to. If the guidance is presenting any particular challenges, and if you would like to any changes to the guidance, what would you say the next stage of the guidance could be that would enable the organisation to function easier? Shall I invite Caroline in first? And perhaps Giles would like to comment as well.
Thank you, Deputy Convener. So my answer related to your previous question about the financial support available to the sector. As the National Lottery, we come from a different perspective in terms of funding a huge number of small independent charitable organisations across the country. So I think it's a different perspective from the Historic Environment Scotland or National Trust issues, in that it's a huge number of very small, fragile organisations that we have had to turn our funding towards as an emergency response. We've spent, as you'll see from our written report, over £6 million supporting the sector, but that support, which was for operational core costs, only lasted for its 4-month tranches. And I have a deep concern that now that we've drawn our funding to an end, that completed close at the 31st of July, that in 4 months or less time, there will then be another cliff edge, which these small independent community heritage organisations from across Scotland will have to face in the winter season when their visitor numbers would already be low. So I think there's a real second cliff edge approaching us, which we all collectively need to think about how to solve. As I said, we've just come to the end of our Heritage Emergency Fund, getting money as quickly as we can out the door across the country, and we're taking a moment now to look around and see what's needed next. But I think that we are facing some very, very difficult times for the smaller independent heritage organisations up and down the length of the country, where the resource we have been able to put forwards will come to an end at a time when their visitor numbers would be at their lowest anyway. So I think some big challenges in the short term for the heritage and cultural sector.
Thank you, Caroline. And Giles, would you like to comment on the funding situation and possibly guidance?
Yes, thank you, Convener. Caroline's message there, I think, is a very good one to follow on from, and in common with some of the other comments. The Abbotsford Trust, we're a completely independent charity. We're dependent on commercial revenue, predominantly as a visitor attraction, but we also do self-catering. But we're always fundraising as well, and we in any given year, we have very, very limited free reserves, which we draw on seasonally in order to see us through the winter period. So Caroline's comments about we may well have stabilised ourselves as a going concern at Abbotsford for this financial year. In our case, that's through to December 2020. Our thoughts are now turning very much to 2021 because our revenues, even in a normal year, not even a coronavirus affected year, drop off a cliff from December and then start to pick up again in March. And that's normally where we would tap into free cash reserves in order to continue to meet our operating costs and pay our salaries. Dependent on how 2021 transpires, whether international visits start to pick up again, we're expecting group travel visits to remain very largely suppressed all the way through next year, no matter what happens. We've had many, many cancellations from most of our large group coach operators, and that constitutes 30% of our business in a normal year. But whether the UK market picks up sufficiently to begin to fill in those gaps remains to be seen. So we're anticipating that there will be a very, very challenging year ahead in 2021. I don't want to be just doom and gloom though, because in our business recovery plan, we can see real opportunities which we would seek to realise. We're particularly fortunate in that we have the 250th anniversary of Sir Walter Scott's birth in 2021, and then leading into 2022, which is the year of storytelling, of course. So we would seek to make the most of that fantastic opportunity in concert and in partnership with many other cultural organisations and academic organisations and community groups, nationally and internationally. So there is a real opportunity there. Our challenge will be realising the limited amount of investment required in order to be able to deliver the programme that could really make the most of that. But we'll be seeking to do that. And I think our attitude at Abbotsford is to innovate and to be creative and to look for changes in our operating model which allow us to adapt to the changing customer market and trends and demands. And there are opportunities there if we can tap into them, especially for the outdoors. And there is going to be an increased demand for the work that we do with our community, particularly for young people and people who recently entered unemployment. So there will be a lot of innovation and creativity that we will aspire to deliver. Some of that will require some limited investment in people or facilities, but our attitude is one of trying to stay as positive as possible through this. Innovate, and then where we can deliver innovation, look for long-term legacy from those innovations.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't know if there's time, convener, for Philip or Alex to respond to the issue about guidance, or we can move on to another member and come back to
that. Could that be very quick? Yeah. Philip.
On guidance, to be concise, I think the current guidance offers both support and challenges. It's supportive in that clear guidance gives us clarity in the visitor arrangements that we can make, and we can calculate our planning and our finances based on that, and make decisions about property reopening. And it gives confidence to our visitors that they can visit safely. We can be clear about the environment that they are coming to. But of course, the guidance does impose restrictions, and they are completely understandable from a health control concern. Inevitably they suppress visitation and the ability to operate to our fullest capacity, particularly our commercial activities. And as circumstances change, it would be very good to think that we will look forward to that guidance changing and relaxing, but not at the expense of an increase in infection. That would have a far worse effect on the trust and its ability to operate, and its relationship with its visitors, and its ability to contribute to the tourism economy of Scotland. I think a wider concern, which I won't go into, but is the wider tourism market. the changing circumstances of that, the domestic versus the international, for example. National Trust of Scotland last year depended on 20% of its visitors was an international market. And so we feel that pain particularly at particular properties where it has made them far harder to make them viable because of that downturn in international tourism.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to bring in Annabelle, followed by Rachel.
Thank you, convener, and good morning, panel. Returning to issues of funding, if I could ask in particular Historic Environment Scotland to provide some more information about the plans for the firstly the 21.3 million funding announcement made, I think, last week by the Cabinet Secretary, and of course in addition to that there's this sum of 5.9 million which I understand is to go to committed heritage projects that are on the go, but it's the actual parameters of that are not entirely clear. So again, it would be helpful if further clarification could be provided on that point as well. Thank you.
We were losing some of your sound, Alex, if you could just start again.
Right, is that better?
Yes.
Right, sorry about that. Yes, the announcement on Friday had two components in it, and this relates back to the sort of the high-level funding package I outlined, or the scenario I outlined a few minutes ago. The 21.3 is there to help us continue to function, to do the roles that we're here to do, our statutory responsibilities. The 5.9 is specifically to support our grants programmes, and specifically to support commitments that we already have in our grants programme. So, as I said earlier, we have disbursed about £14.5 million per annum over a number of years through our grants programme. The grants programme is not ring-fenced. That funding is just part of the overall HES funding. And so we have quite significant commitments for this year to projects, to organisations, and as part of addressing our own financial challenges, then we were speaking to Scottish Government and pleased to secure additional support to make sure we can continue to offer support to existing commitments, but also to talk to those grantees about some of the challenges they're currently facing, and to see whether we can help address some of the issues such as increased costs or delays to projects. So those were the two components on Friday. Support for us as an organisation to help us continue to fund our activities and the benefits that flows through to the wider economy, including but not exclusively linked to or limited to the reopening of our sites, and also funding to support existing grant commitments.
Thank you for that. It might be helpful actually if you could write to the committee, just providing a bit more detail in writing about both questions, because I appreciate we probably don't have time this morning. There's a lot of members that want to cover a lot of issues. Obviously, you know, it's welcome news for Historic Environment Scotland that this money has been made available by the Scottish Government, but taking up the point of Caroline from the National Lottery Heritage Fund, obviously there's a number of smaller independent organisations who are really struggling, and I wonder, you know, is there any role for Historic Environment Scotland in that regard?
There is, and I think this is where our dual role is actually quite important. We have to function as Historic Environment Scotland, but we also have to have that mind to the wider sector that we are asked to be the lead body for. So I think there's a number of things we have done and are doing. So, for example, one is providing some flexibility in our grants programmes to respond to the challenges that current grant recipients are facing. Secondly, we're providing a lot of advice to organisations, particularly around about reopening and how to do that safely, which is helpful. We have ongoing discussions with government around whether there is scope to provide additional financial support going forward to organisations who are in challenging times, and to do that in a way which doesn't duplicate or offset a number of the other support schemes that are already in place. But I think one of the fundamental things we're doing, and I chair a group of chief executives from the forum, is to start thinking beyond the current and into the longer term, and how do we find a way forward that provides us with a more resilient sector going forward. I don't think we've got answers to that yet, because I think everybody is still, to a large extent, focusing on the here and now challenges. But I think there are opportunities there. And just to touch on a couple of things, I don't want to take too long on this, but go back to the convener's opening question, what does the longer term for this sector look like? There are huge challenges just now, but I think there are also a number of opportunities which, when the time is right, we need to look at trying to exploit. I think we need to change the narrative about heritage. A lot of it is about the past, but we don't live in the past. It's how do we use the past to create a better tomorrow, a better today. And so an awful lot of what the heritage sector does, what we do, contributes to the national performance indicators, is mainstreamed across an awful lot of government policies. So I think seeing the heritage sector as a real active contributor to economic growth, skills, to placemaking, to the well-being agenda, a really important contributor to the green agenda and the climate change agenda going forward. I think there's an opportunity there to think about recasting the narrative, seeing what we as a sector do, not just about the past, but as a really important contributor to the future. The sector contributes, pre-COVID, £4.3 billion per annum to the Scottish economy and employs either directly or indirectly 6,000 to 8,000 jobs. That makes it significant, and I think the opportunity now exists for it to be a bit more mainstream in an awful lot of the policy considerations that we're taking forward as a nation.
Thank you. Rachel Hamilton.
I really admire the positivity of Alex Patterson, and I know looking for solutions is the way forward. However, the the decline in the number of tourists is going to be absolutely catastrophic, and the recovery of that is going to take some time. I actually wanted to direct my question at Philip Long. I was wondering, pre-COVID, the National Trust did have, I suppose they had difficulties financially, and I wondered if you have enough funds in your reserves to meet liabilities and outgoings. I mean, I know it sounded as though you were looking close to having to wind up the National Trust. This does apply to other panelists as well today. If you're relying on dipping into reserves, how sustainable really is that? And I know that Alex Patterson mentioned that there was a 53 million funding gap, and he also mentioned that he'd made savings of 16 million. It's all very well having efficiencies, but if we're looking at down the barrel of not having the tourists, and does that mean we're going to have more redundancies? Lots of questions in there.
And thank you for that. First of all, I'll deal with the threat to the trust. At the outbreak of the pandemic, and as the executive began to address that, there was a serious concern with the degree of uncertainty that it could be an existential threat to the trust. Our income streams our income depends substantially on earned income through visited properties, through membership, through philanthropic activity, and with the closure of properties, then that provided a very substantial concern to NTS as to whether it could weather that storm. And as a consequence, actions were taken quickly to be able to address that. And the situation that we are now, which through those actions, which I've talked about earlier on, so I won't rehearse them again, but also because of the support from government and because of the support from people across Scotland and internationally, has brought the trust back to a position where, in fact, in our board meeting today, we will be putting forward accounts to our board, which demonstrate that we can continue to be a going concern, and so that is good news. However, the more that we can invest in our activities in the future, the more that we can enable the trust to continue to work towards a more sustainable position. You're right in noting that the trust has faced financial challenges in the past, but in fact, in recent times, the corporate plan that the trust had put in place has enabled it to work towards a position of greater sustainability, which is why it is all the more acutely painful the circumstances that have hit the trust and the heritage sector and the rest of the world, but particularly within the tourist economy, right at the beginning of that that tourism economy, and that is going to be a concern in the future. As I've mentioned, and as we know, international tourism is substantially non-existent at the moment, and and the proportion of it is significant. But the proportion of it, which is also of particular commercial benefit, is vital to our organisations as well. We have seen that there is the return to visiting our properties from our domestic audience is wonderful to see, but it doesn't have the same commercial benefit, for example, that an international tourism audience tends to have.
Can I just develop that line of questioning? Your answers there, they don't really include perhaps how you might have to readjust to what the National Trust stands for. So, for example, will you continue with your essential conservation, curating, protecting our national treasures? Will there be considerations at the board meeting today of further asset sale? I mean, I admire each and every one of you for getting through. We all have to get through this pandemic and work out how we get out on the other side. But I mean, Caroline mentioned a cliff edge. Do you really believe that there is a medium and long-term sustainability? You've described the short-term stability, which has been from government intervention.
The government intervention has been vital in enabling the trust to demonstrate going concern, and with the wider actions that we've taken, we are able to we have been able to not look at not just the immediate short term, which has involved the reopening of more properties and therefore the saving of more positions, but it will enable us to begin to invest in activities and conservation projects that we had put on hold. We would like to do more of that in the future, because that will contribute to building up the trust's resilience and sustainability. But if I can turn to the point about that you've mentioned about some of the areas that the trust might need to look at in the future and how it begins to rethink itself, reinvent itself for the future. There's a short-term job to do to ensure stability and continuing agility with the continuing circumstances of uncertainty. So we will be putting in place a short-term plan for next year that enables us to, as best as possible, respond to that continuing uncertainty, and particularly that unknown tourism economy. But as we move into next year, what we will be doing across the trust, and we will be consulting across the trust's employees, volunteers, membership, and more widely with our stakeholders, a longer term plan for the trust that addresses some of these issues. So, for example, it will be wise for us to look at a review of our overall estate as ongoing work that we do to explore how we best use it in the future, take from it the lessons that we've learned in these very difficult circumstances, all with the intention to ensure that we continue to fulfil our fundamental conservation mission and our ability to make our estate as accessible as possible and to inspire people, but also to think even more so about the opportunities that are presenting themselves to the trust and to the wider sector. Alex has rightly said that the heritage sector has an opportunity here not to be thought of as something which is simply about custodian and care, but as a major player in the wider Scottish infrastructure, which includes the contribution that it can make to society, community, the economy, whether it's employment, skills development, how we support the development of employment for young people, tourism, sustainability, how we care for the environment. The group that is giving evidence today is responsible, as we all understand, for a great deal more than the built historic fabric. We are responsible for very substantial parts of the landscape of Scotland, for example, which is utilised in so many ways. And so I think we have a major role to play in thinking about how we take forward our function in response to this, and the contribution that we can make to the wider country.
Thank you, Philip. And can I extend that question to Alex Patterson as well at Historic Environment Scotland? Obviously, Alex, we've talked before about the mitigating climate change risk, and that is going to add, obviously, to the costs that you are incurring. I can't really see how you've met that funding gap. Can you explain a little bit more about that and the long-term sustainability?
Yeah, and so you're absolutely right. Climate change is impacting on the historic environment. We can see it through our sites, and you can see it through historic properties across the country, in fact across the world, that the changes in the climate is accelerating the decay of many historic properties, and more of our time is going into trying to mitigate that. And there are good examples across the country where we've done that, whether it be reinforcing the dunes at Scarborough or energy efficiency measures at Edinburgh Castle. So climate change is having an impact, clearly, and from our point of view going forward, that will be an important priority. But I just want to agree wholeheartedly with Philip's comments that while we've been very pleased to secure additional funding from the government for this year, we are in no way complacent or to suggest that things will go back to normal, or that we shouldn't, or that we don't need to revisit our business model and our organisational priorities going forward. We absolutely do. And while we don't have a board meeting this morning, I just reassure the committee that my board is very actively engaged in just that conversation. We call it reimagining. How has COVID changed the operating environment in which we operate? And what do we need to do to respond to that? Recognising a number of things. We have statutory functions. There are unknowns out there in terms of the health pandemic and how it might pan out. Unknowns around visitor return, which is clearly a critical component of all of our income streams. So we are looking at how do we respond and how do we adapt our priorities going forward. And as Rachel said, climate change and other things only increase the challenge. And some of the things we're looking at, some of the things the sector are looking at, have been heightened by the impact of COVID. Some of them were there beforehand as well. And so one of the big discussions that was taking place through one of the subgroups of the OPIT strategy was looking at how do we manage the built environment going forward? How do we prioritise where investment needs to go on the basis that there will never be enough money to go around to do everything? So some of those questions were there before, and they're probably in starker relief now as we collectively think forward, hopefully beyond the current pandemic situation.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm now going to bring in Oliver Mundell because I know that you've got to leave earlier, Oliver, so if you would like to come in now.
Thank you, Convener. I really appreciate that. I primarily wanted to start by asking Philip Long. I know that things are very hard. You've had to make some very difficult choices, but I wondered what the rationale was for removing some of the ranger roles from your sites. I'm particularly interested from a constituency point of view in the Greymare's Tail, which has proved very popular with visitors since lockdown restrictions were lifted. I know many people, including the convener, have raised concerns with you around that, with issues on overcrowding and people behaving irresponsibly. I just wondered how getting rid of a role like that ties in, with your environmental commitments and kind of commitments across the country.
Thank you, Oliver, and thank you for recognising the severity of the impact on the Trust, which has meant that we were required to look at one of our major costs, which is our staff. We have been pleased to have reduced the number of staff losses across the organisation, as I mentioned earlier on. But the severity of the pandemic has left no parts of the organisation untouched. We have gone through a consultancy process with our staff and with our union, and have come to the result that I referred to earlier on. We have been able to save significantly more Rangers positions than were put at risk at present. And at Greymare's Tail, I can assure you that a Rangers service will continue, which will be supported by our centralised staff. But as with a number of our wild landscape properties, where we don't have a dedicated full-time Rangers service, we are not able to continue with a dedicated full-time Ranger service at Greymare's Tail, which is also the case with some other properties. But I can assure you that a Ranger service will continue there. We will keep that under review, because we have seen that, fortunately, and I think it's a great opportunity for the Trust and for other organisations responsible for our landscape, whether it's our design landscape or our wild landscape, how much people have valued being able to return to that as lockdown restrictions continue. It has been a concern to us, it's been a concern to government and to the country how some of that landscape has been treated. And we will want to make sure that we keep how we care for the landscape that we're responsible for and the resources that we can put into that under review.
Thank you for that. I mean, it is helpful. I just wonder how hard you pushed for those roles in dialogue with the government, because again, I understand some of your other sites maybe more, bring in more revenue, and have more opportunities to bring in income. But in terms of these sites that are so important to our landscape, so important to our environment, and attract a large number of visitors, did you specially ask for additional funding to support that particular stream of your work?
The funding the funding that we've received has supported the reopening of properties and jobs across the organisation. My priority since joining the Trust 2 months ago has been to secure as much support as possible to reopen as many properties as possible and save as many jobs as possible. And while I'm very pleased at how many that we have been able to save, and that we've been able to save a significant number of Rangers posts than were originally at threat, it has not been possible to save all Rangers positions, and it's not been possible to save all job categories across the whole of the organisation. And so we have had to take hard decisions across the Trust's across all of the resources at the Trust, which we would have preferred not to have had to taken, but that is the reality of the financial impact. We will continue to review that as we continue to understand and what the financial circumstances will be in the future, and we will need to balance that with any further pressure that comes on how we care for our properties.
Thank you. Thank you. I cut off Annabelle Ewing because of a technical issue before she was finished. Annabelle, do you want to quickly come back in?
Yes. Thank you, computer. I don't know, the computer just went down. Notwithstanding, I'm actually in the Parliament, so I should be the one that has the best service, I would have thought. Yeah, just there's a few other questions I wanted to ask on the issue of funding, and if I could ask Historic Environment Scotland. It's firstly, would they wish to see the furlough scheme extended? We see, for example, in France and Germany, an extension of furlough for a further 12 months. Is that something that Historic Environment Scotland would wish to see? And second, in their submission to the committee, Historic Environment Scotland argued for a reduction in the current 20% VAT rate applying to refurbishment, repair, etc. of non-new builds. And it would be helpful if that ask could be clarified and in terms of the rate that they would seek, and what assessment they have made as to what they would argue, I would imagine, would be beneficial impact of such a VAT reduction. Thank you.
In response to the two questions, I think on the furlough scheme, we've been able to tap into. I don't think I would advocate its extension just for HES, but I know that the sector more generally would certainly welcome. I think the extension of the scheme on the basis that income recovery, securing jobs, retaining jobs is still a hugely important issue for the sector. So if that was possible, I think the sector would welcome it. And in terms of the VAT issue, this comes through one of as I said, the Our Place and Time working groups. It was a view across the entire sector that the VAT applied to the maintenance, repair, retrofit of historic properties, as opposed to, I think it's the zero rating of VAT on new builds, was potentially a disincentive to investment. And so at the last meeting of that group, we agreed we would do exactly what you suggested, which is look at it in a bit more detail. But it's in our submission as one of the ideas that I think is worth pursuing as a way to try and incentivise investment in the historic environment.
Okay. Thank you, Convener. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I guess the other heritage organisations, I'm sure, would certainly appreciate that VAT cut as well. Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Convener. It's a question, actually, it could be to any of the panellists, but probably more towards Alex and Philip. You'll be very much aware of the Black Lives Matter campaign, and you'll also be aware of the announcement this week by the Scottish Government in the Programme for Government regarding funding, and looking at at Scotland's role in slavery, and also the consultation is going to take place there going forward. Now that piece of work is going to take place by museums, Galleries Scotland, and also and not yourselves. But how do you see the role of your organisations? First of all, playing a part of that particular piece of work, but also where do you see your organisations going forward in addressing the responsibilities you have regarding Black Lives Matter? If we go to Philip first.
We see that as vitally important work. I was pleased to see that being announced, and I would want NTS and other organisations to be included in that. And I hope the definition of those involved will include bodies such as ours. We, after all, are responsible for the built heritage and for objects in their original locations, and we have been clear that a substantial amount of our properties will have been brought into being through wealth. That is part of those difficult histories that everybody in the world is increasingly facing up to. We have been undertaking work on that, and we are also putting forward proposals within the Trust to address this even more so. And we think it is an absolutely vital part of how we interpret our properties. We think it also helps visitors to our properties understand that organisations like the Trust are thinking about these very relevant issues, and therefore those properties continue in their relevance to people today. Black Lives Matter and legacies of slavery is one aspect of this, but within the Trust and across the museums and galleries and heritage sector, I am part of and am aware of discussions going on which looks at wider concerns about issues of legacy issues of colonialism or lack of equalities that are right that we face up to in the heritage that we are responsible for.
Thank you, Alex. And before you answer that, I know obviously Hez were planning to do some research, certainly in this particular area. So I'd be grateful if you could provide an update on that as well, please.
Thank you, Stuart. Yes, so I think the first thing I would say, is clearly this is echoing Philip, a really important matter for us. There's a few things we're doing, partly timing. We are about to consult on our new equalities outcomes. We're going to do that anyway, but clearly the Black Lives Matters is an important dimension in that, and of course equalities and inclusiveness has been a key part of all of our work across many years. A BSL strategy, for example, last year was produced and so on. But on the specifics of this, it is our responsibility to make sure that in telling the story, whether through our records or through our interpretation, we're telling the story of all of Scotland. And you're right, we did say we were going to do some research. We did a bit of work last year just scoping out what this might look like, and we now actually have moved that forward into a partnership with the Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights and Edinburgh University. So that is looking at the legacies of slavery and related matters on Scotland's built environment. So that will be, I think, announced very quickly, very soon. That's imminent. And just in recent weeks, a number of heritage organisations across the UK, ourselves, Historic England, English Heritage, some others have been discussing the opportunity to collaborate on this issue, so that we're taking a UK-wide approach to it as well. Clearly, we'd want to make sure that our contribution to that, or the benefits we got from that, are very relevant to Scotland. But to assure you that this is very much on our agenda, we are developing an action plan internally. But on the specifics of the research, then the projects I outlined with CRER and the University of Edinburgh is kicking off imminently.
No, thanks for that. Can I just come back on that particular point? So in terms of that work that's been undertaken, has that been city focused in Scotland, or is it across all of Scotland?
It might be best if I drop you a note, Stuart, on the detail of it. I don't think it's been city focused. I think it's been more general than that. But I maybe speak to my colleague who's more close to it, and maybe just drop you a note on the terms of reference for that.
Yeah, that'd be very helpful. Thank you. Because genuinely, the area that I represent, sadly, has got a strong history in the triangular trade, and that story needs to be told, because it's very much part of Scotland, but that story does need to be told. And I would like to see anything that does go forward actually tells the story from all of Scotland, and not solely, and understand why, but not solely focused upon the cities.
Well, from an HES point of view, I give you that undertaking. I've noticed in the media in the last few days your own sort of proposals for Greenock, but I agree entirely with your words, which is the stories that are told need to be for the whole of Scotland and all its people. So I assure you that's our agenda, but I'll write to you separately on the details.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Convener, if I may just ask one final question. It's on the Build Back Better approach that has been spoken about, certainly by the Scottish Government, I know the UK Government and others. I know some of what's been touched upon already, I think it ties into this, but I know Philip Long spoke about the engaging with the members and the staff for a longer term approach, and Alex spoke about the also the reducing the costs and some sites paused for in the short term. But in terms of, as an example, the next 5 years or 10 years, where would the panelists actually see the organisations that they represent and how effective they will actually be certainly for the areas that they cover, but also in terms of the employment opportunities within their organisations. Maybe start with Giles first.
Yes, thank you for that question. I think what I'd do is I'd take us back to some of the points that many of us were making earlier in this committee, which is that our sector as a whole, whether it's the National Trust, HES, or the many independent organisations of which the Abbotsford Trust is one, have an enormous amount to contribute in a very unique way across a range of agendas, which is, yes, it's about the economy, it's about job creation, but more so, it's also about our place in the community. And with our charitable missions, we have a real opportunity to make a very real difference in our locality. The stories that we have to tell, the deep history that we draw on, means that we enjoy a very, very special place in our communities. Passions run very deep, and that's been amply demonstrated throughout this year by the intense feelings that have been engendered through closures and reopening at many of our sites. But that passion allows us to actually work with our community in very unique and different ways. This is clearly not a flash in a plan problem. The impact of the virus is going to be with us for quite some time to come, and we all know that the economic impact is only just beginning. But we have an opportunity as a sector and as individual organisations to play a really important role within our community to help those who might have been made unemployed. Many of us are very, very active with volunteering. We can build on that, and I think what would be really incumbent on us would be to spread the age group and the demographic profiles of our volunteering. We can support our communities in ways that are far more than just the harder let's create jobs, let's create wealth. But both of those agendas are important. And that has to be, as we come through this, we have to plan for the short term for the impact of this year, next year, and the year after. But yes, we have to build back better, and I think there is a real opportunity for us to do that if we're able to, if we're given the opportunities to do so.
Thanks.
Okay.
Could perhaps bring in Caroline next, because we obviously, as I said at the beginning, we don't have time to go to every single panel member, Stuart, and then respect you in your third question. So I'm also keen to hear Susan as well as some supplementary. So I think, Caroline, you would be able to give a kind of overview in terms of speak across the sector in response to Stuart's question there.
Thank you, Joan. I had comments certainly on the Build Back Better approach, where I can concur entirely with Giles' comments about the importance of our heritage assets as anchors in the community. And I think we really saw that with the way some of the buildings, such as Dunoon Borough Halls, turned itself around from being an arts and heritage asset to a community kitchen throughout the pandemic. And these assets hold communities together, and they have become really clearly precious to the identity of place around the country. And we need to build on that using the new value that's been placed on the local green space, local heritage assets, to create a sense of community that also helps to translate into the new kind of tourism that we're going to need to see developing, where we look at what the multiple holistic aspects a place has that can draw visitors, local visitors, to it. I also just wanted, if I can, Stuart, to go back to your point about the Black Lives Matters movement, which for us at the National Lottery Heritage Fund is hugely significant. And as you know, we work with culture and heritage across the spectrum: natural heritage, land, buildings, museum collections. And so we have seen the breadth of impact that movement has on Scotland's heritage. We've been supporting that in working with that a number of ways, of bringing in diversity of mentors for some of the boards that we work with across Scotland, because the magnitude and significance of that subject is so great that I think we need to recognise that a wider infrastructure of support is going to be needed to see the sector through dealing with that well. But I also wanted to flag that we have just awarded a specific solicited grant to Inverclyde Council, £230,000, to allow a re-examination of collections with the communities affected, and looking at decolonising and how this could be reframed in light of the work of the Black Lives Matter movement. So I just wanted to highlight that to you today.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. And certainly, would you be prepared to talk to the working group that I've set up, just regarding what other activities we could potentially undertake within Inverclyde?
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I now bring in Beatrice Wishart.
Thank you, Convener. My first question is to Caroline. We've already touched on the sort of cliff edge for many of the independent heritage sectors. I wondered, in your submission, you said about ensuring a robust and resourced local authority sector for the long term, and referencing local authority museums, archives and heritage services. I wonder where in that conclusion you have considered organisations that are funded partly by local authorities and partly by arm's length organisations. I wonder if you could expand on that.
Yes, I'm happy to do that. There are a collection of the ALIOs in particular, which, when you look back at the support that's been made available through COVID, haven't been able to access as much support as some of the other heritage and culture bodies. And we now have a real concern about how to support them as we move forwards. They're fundamental backbone to the culture and heritage sector here, and they have not had the resources, the emergency support that some other parts of the sector have had. I think there's a lot of risk around those museums, heritage assets being closed and then just not reopening again. I think we need to be really cognizant of that risk and keep an eye on it, because those museums and heritage bodies around the country perform far more than just the function of protecting and maintaining our collections and assets. You know, they have a strong community role as well, and keep a lot of other heritage organisations afloat with their expertise. And so it's something that I think it would be well worth considering further in the next stage of support.
Thank you for that, Caroline. That's helpful. I do agree that they are very much part of the community and very valued. My second question is one that actually Giles just touched on earlier. It's about the volunteers who keep many organisations going. How is that where they keep you going in normal times, and they obviously haven't been able to contribute during the last 6 months? How have your organisations been able to maintain contact with the volunteers, and what kind of feedback have you had from your volunteers about coming back to be part of the new revived Build Back Better organisations? I wonder if I could address that to Alex and Philip first, please.
Thank you. Yeah, so we have a number of volunteers that work with us on a whole range of different activities, partly on our sites, working with supporting the visitors who arrive, but also in our archives, at our engine shed, and so on. And clearly, the level of involvement from our volunteers has been considerably less over recent months than it would have been I'm going to say in a normal year, but you know what I mean. We have kept in touch with them. We have a team across the organisation that keeps in regular touch with our volunteers through newsletters and regular communication. So we regard our volunteers on the same basis as we do our staff. And so we've sought to keep in touch regularly with them over the course of the current situation. I'm not entirely sure that we will be asking many of them to come back, certainly this summer, but certainly we'll be working hard over the winter to make sure we stay engaged with our volunteers and hopefully have a way of bringing them back safely at the start of the next tourism season.
Thank you. And Philip?
Thank you. And before I answer the volunteer question, I would just like to pick up, if I may, on the point that Caroline last made. I think a wider concern that is important for this committee to note is the potential failure of organisations responsible for our heritage. It's hard to believe, unfortunately, that all organisations are going to survive. And it's an important point to address, to continue to think about, is how will our heritage continue to be cared for in the event that organisations may well fail. To come to volunteers, the Trust was established as a voluntary organisation back in 1931. These days we have about 2,500 volunteers. They are an essential part of our operation. The Trust is effectively a community of professionally employed staff, of volunteers, of members, of wider stakeholders. And our volunteers play a vital role in enabling the organisation to operate. For example, at the Georgian House in Edinburgh, we have a rota of some 250 volunteers that help us, that enable that property to be open to the public and to be cared for. We've kept in touch throughout. I'm sure we could have done even more to keep in touch, but some 70% of our staff were furloughed at the high point of the furloughing scheme, so we've not been able to operate as we would like to throughout. And we are now bringing back volunteers, and I have been meeting with volunteers in properties, and it's very clear. It's been very clear to me the vital role that volunteers play in enabling our properties to operate, and not just our properties, but through the wider conservation and maintenance work that volunteers contribute to across the organisation. And at the same time, it's been made very clear to me by the volunteers that the role that an organisation such as the Trust has in enabling people to be involved in caring for and important parts of our heritage is something that they themselves very much value individually and as a community in bringing people together, particularly in countryside and more remote areas. We talked earlier on in this call about the diversity of volunteers, and I think that's an important thing to look for in the future. The majority of our volunteers are of an older generation, and we would like to see how we can broaden out volunteer involvement even more so.
Thank you. I think that is a very good point, and I think there's so much that the older volunteers can bring in getting new volunteers and all their wealth of experience. Thank you, convener. I realise I've got no other question.
Thank you. I actually have a supplementary from Stuart McMillan, who's put in the chat box about that specific point, and he's saying, if organisations fail, what would happen to the heritage asset? I don't know if anybody wants to come in on that. So Alec Patterson, as a given your overarching responsibility, I mean.
No, I think the point that Philip makes is a very good, and it's a very real challenge. I would hesitate to say that all assets come to us, because I don't think that's the case, and we look after assets on behalf of ministers, and there's very clearly criteria for things that come into care and things that go out of care. But I think the conversation has to be had, because I agree with Philip, the chances of every organisation and every asset being able to find a resilient way forward, sustainable way forward, I think that's quite challenging to see that outcome here. And so it comes back to the issues about prioritisation, about different models of how we work with trust and organisations. For example, we are exploring one or two models where we might partner with local communities or with other organisations to look at how we can take forward properties going forward. So I think the challenge is real, and I think what it requires is some innovative thinking, different approaches than perhaps have been the traditional approaches to see how some of those important properties or bits of cultural infrastructure can be sustained going forward.
Thanks. Can I just ask Philip, I understand that I was very pleased that in the southwest of Scotland Broughton House was saved, because that's a really important cultural asset, and I wrote to you about it, and I'm really pleased to see that not only has it been saved, but it's going to be open over the winter, which is really fantastic. However, I'm hearing that Carlisle's house in Ecclefechan is under threat, and I know that that is an asset in a small community, and actually since the National Trust have begun working on it, it has really galvanised the community, and the number of volunteers before the pandemic had risen. And I don't know, I mean, I'm springing it on you at the moment, but I just wondered if there's anything you could share with us on that. I mean, Carlisle might not be fashionable these days, but it's an important historical figure, and the story of Carlisle's house is very important. So I wondered if there's anything you could share on that.
Yeah, I understand your concern, and across the Trust, we have a concern about not being able to reopen all of our properties. That is the reality of the ongoing financial situation. We, through the support that we've received from government and the support that we've received through our appeal, as I've noted, we've been able to reopen more properties this year, and we've been able to bring forward the reopening of some of properties next year that we may not have been able to open until the summer months. I understand why one might single out that property. I could talk passionately about all of the properties from their heritage purpose and the value in having them open. I think the thing to say right at the moment is that we're keeping all of that under review, and as the circumstances change, we will want to be able to reopen as many properties as we can, as soon as we are able, according to the sort of wider circumstances of the tourism season. But if I may, I'll keep in touch with you directly, particularly about that property that you've asked me about.
Okay, thank you very much. And I've got a separate question, very quick question from Rachel Hamilton. Rachel, do you want to come in?
Thank you, Convener. I just wondered if any of the panellists had any involvement in the Scottish Tourism Emergency Response Group and the recovery plan that they have set out.
I think I'm still live, so I will say that both in my previous position at V&A Dundee, where I was at the beginning of the pandemic, and now at the National Trust of Scotland, we did have involvement with that group, and I have colleagues within the Trust that are keeping closely in touch with Visit Scotland. I know certainly that I found that group a very useful early grouping that was responding with intelligence and insight to the changing tourism situation and informing the sector about that. And what I have seen across this is the way that organisations that might not have been as close before have come together in the face of this enormous challenge. And I'm sure all of us will want to continue to work in these close ways and not lose these connections in the future.
Alec Patterson.
Echo Philip's comments there. We are not formally a part of that group, but we work hand in glove with Visit Scotland and other parts of the tourism sector. We also, one of my fellow directors chairs a heritage tourism group, which involves Visit Scotland and other partners as well. And of course, we're part of ASVA and ALVA, so we're well tied into an awful lot of the tourism groups that are up and running across Scotland and further afield. So while we're not part of that group, then we work on a daily basis with Visit Scotland and other players within the tourism and hospitality sectors.
Can I just follow on from that? Because as well as the Scottish Tourism Emergency Response Group, there is another organisation which is about looking forward. And you say that you're not on STERG, but do you happen to know if the heritage sector has a position on these groups that have been set up going forward? Because we know how important cultural tourism is, and indeed spend from cultural tourism is higher than tourism generally. So I think it's important that you are actually represented on national action plans and groups that are reshaping the sector for the future.
So I agree entirely with that. I do sit, my organisation sits on the ministerial high-level tourism group. It hasn't met for a wee while, but we are part of that, and therefore contribute to that forum. I think to have a view, not particularly. I think I had a view a few months ago, which was really that in terms of the guidance that was coming out, partly from a tourism point of view, partly from a construction point of view, partly from a whatever point of view, then the heritage sector actually straddles across many of those other sectors. So making sure there was a coherence to the guidance was really important. But I think in response to one of the previous questions, the guidance is what we take our steer from, and we adapt and mould our activities and our adaptation and preparation of our sites to meet the guidance that the Scottish Government issues. And I have to say, doing that has been the right thing to do, because the feedback we're having from our visitors is that they feel safe. They appreciate the efforts and the work that we have undertaken to make the sites ready, albeit not all sites can be accessed because of physical distancing requirements. Capacity limitations apply. But that concern has gone. I think we're in a good place now, but we are part of the ministerial high-level tourism working group, and as I say, beyond that, we have good connections, if not formally part of all of these other groups.
Okay, thanks very much. I think Giles wanted to come in. Giles?
Yes, thank you very much. I just wanted to just mention the value of more localised partnerships as well within the sector. Often ones that straddle tourism and culture and heritage. The new agency for the south of Scotland is stepping up to invest in a new destination partnership for the south of Scotland. And as important as the national groups are, getting the word through to more local businesses and supporting them is equally as important if we're going to make sure that the recovery is as widespread and as deep as possible.
Yeah. Thanks very much. That's a very good point. And I have a question from Claire Baker to Caroline. Claire.
Thank you, Convener. Caroline, in the briefing that you provided for us, it says that as the Heritage Emergency Fund application is now closed, there's an estimated funding gap of between £24 and £29 million in the remainder of this financial year for the heritage sector. I know there's plans to open another emergency fund, but are those figures still accurate? Is that still the case given the recent announcement?
Good point about the recent announcements, but the gap is absolutely up to date. Those are our latest figures. We would need to backfill against the latest government announcements against that. But actually, as I touched on, the parts of the sector we deal with, the local independent heritage and cultural organisations across the country, the lottery, have been providing the ongoing emergency support for that. That sector, the community heritage centres, the historic sites and assets and houses around and buildings around the country, that they're not particularly catered for by the latest package of funding, and that is something that we're in conversation with partners across the heritage sector in terms of how we can rise to meet their needs. So while we haven't yet crunched the numbers back with the announcements that came out on Friday, the built heritage sector, the small independent sites that aren't necessarily a museum or a cultural venue, are at the moment potentially falling between gaps. So it's very important that we do that cross-referencing and see where need still lies, because winter is coming, and there is going to be a very, very challenging outlook for some of these organisations that don't fit fit in neatly into the existing schemes.
Thank you.
Can I just follow up on that, Caroline? You responded very effectively to the pandemic in that you suspended your funding programmes and brought in the emergency programme and then the restart programme. Given that your other funding programmes are still suspended, what are your plans going forward? I know that you're not going to come back in the same way, but what are your plans in terms of the next stage once we've got the restart over with?
We at the National Lottery Heritage Fund are absolutely at a pivot point. We've come to the end of, we obviously drew all of the cash that we could together from National Lottery players' ticket sales, have used that up as effectively as we can. We now have the rest of the financial year to deal with. We're looking at the moment at what our financial position is and how quickly and effectively we can get that out, but we're absolutely where we need to take a moment now to look at where the needs lie, because I think all of the presentations today have really shown that there are new themes coming out, things like digital infrastructure, how to support volunteers safely, the structural reliance of our sector on volunteering and other perhaps not such robust sort of mechanisms. We need to have a really good look at that and be careful to focus our next set of funding precisely where it can be most effective. So we've just done some deep dive research into organisations' needs across the country and what they think is likely to be their biggest risk areas. We'll be following that up with some further survey research and then pointing our funding where it's most needed. I think the other thing to flag is we have the real issue of projects that were in delivery on the ground when the COVID hit, where the builders have literally had to down tools and leave fragile, precious heritage assets half restored. And so we're having a big focus at the moment on just how to get that restarted. Obviously, there are additional costs around all of these big capital projects, and some of them are around our most iconic heritage in the country, Citizens Theatre, the Borough, big, important heritage assets that we as a nation need to see completed successfully, but were just by sheer bad luck hit during the physical delivery programme. So I think we've got the capital issues of those big builds, but also the ongoing revenue support over the winter period to ensure that we actually have the organisations still standing, able to take advantage of whatever spring 2021 looks like in terms of visitors and revenue generation.
Sure. Thanks very much. That's very helpful. Thank you. In England, the National Lottery Heritage Fund has been involved in advising governments with regard to distributing the funds. What's your relationship with government in Scotland?
Had a very strong and positive experience of working with Scottish Government during the COVID situation. So we are in regular discussions with the Culture Department, and also, as I've said, we have a wider remit. So we're also working with Environment Department colleagues, trying to work out where best to align our funding with that's coming from other sources. So in the course of that, we have discussed shared priorities and aligning where possible, and we are still in dialogue and here to be as useful as we can be in helping the sector recover along with Scottish Government colleagues.
That's great. Thank you very much. We don't have any more supplementaries, and we've actually run out of time. I'd like to thank all our panel members for coming along today. It's been a really interesting session, and I've certainly appreciate it, and apologies for the technical issues initially. That concludes the public part of this morning's meeting. The committee will shortly consider the evidence heard in private. So I thank the panel again, and I'll close this part of the meeting. I'll give a couple of minutes for members to have a comfort break before we resume in private session. Thank you very much again to our panel, and goodbye.